Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. We have a terrific panel for you today, and we're talking about nothing less than a project that hopes to strengthen American democracy. It's a heavy lift, no small project. And the leader of this operation is a guy named Harry Wiland, who I've known for a long time. And Harry is founder, co-president, and co-CEO of the Media Policy Center. He's produced public television and multimedia for more than 35 years. Harry's a director, member of the Directors Guild of America, and also a member of the Academy of Television Arts and the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences. He joins us to discuss his new project called Imagine Democracy. And he has a number of heavyweight historians involved in the project. Two of them join us today. Tammy Greer is an assistant professor of political science at Clark Atlanta University, where she focuses on American government, urban politics, comparative politics, and international politics. She also serves on the board of advisors for the Imagine Democracy project. And Ted Widmer also serves on that board. He's a historian, writer, librarian, and musician. Ted, I love the introduction, the perfect Renaissance man description. He's also served as a speechwriter for President Clinton, and his latest book is the New York Times bestseller, Lincoln on the Verge, 13 Days to Washington. Thrilled to have all of you with us. Welcome to Wilson Center Now.
Wonderful to be here.
Thank you, John.
Harry, I want to begin with you with just an overview of the project. Tell us about Imagine Democracy and what you envision.
Sure. I was reading a New York Times article about the Constitution, and there was a piece about a thing called the Three-Fifths Compromise, and I had no idea what it was. I started reading about it, and I found out, the more I found out, the more upset I became. It was the compromise between Southern representatives and Northern representatives at the end of the convention in Philadelphia in 1787 that allowed everybody to go home. And it counted slaves as 3/5 of a human being, allowing the South to have a disproportionate advantage in representation in Congress, in the Electoral College. And just the idea upset me. And I realized I didn't know anything about it. I started asking people, do you know what the Three-Fifths Compromise was, how it was created? No one knew. And I said, this is an original sin. This is not a true democracy. And how we were all taught about the Constitution in grade school and in college and, excuse me, beyond that. But what we were taught was just 3/5, wasn't the truth. Wanted to do something about it. Called up Ted Widmer, said, Ted, do you want to get involved? And I'll let him talk about it and Tammy talk about it further.
Well, Ted, was Harry Wiland unique in not having heard of the Three-Fifths Compromise?
No, I mean, it's this terribly embarrassing blot on our record at the beginning of our history. And I think a lot of Americans would rather not know about it. But Harry is unique in his ability to put a team together and just his perseverance. When he doesn't know something, he wants to understand it. So he began calling and emailing. And I felt like I knew it from all of my years of studying history. I knew sort of your 5-second answer to what it was. But the more I looked into it, the more troubling it was. It's also very tied to the Electoral College, which we're having a lot of misgivings about. A lot of Americans from a lot of different backgrounds are troubled about the Electoral College. And it just seemed like we didn't get everything right at the beginning of our history. And it's not unpatriotic to say that. In fact, the founders would want us to fix the things they couldn't fix in their day. So we're taking a hard look at all of these things.
Tammy, your students, what do they know about the Three-Fifths Compromise? Are young people aware of what Ted describes as a flaw at the founding? And we should go, I mean, people owned people. The nation was built with slavery as part of the law of the land. So the Three-Fifths Compromise is one aberrant example of that. But even if you go beyond that, America's mythology doesn't always add up with the realities.
Yes, I completely agree. My students initially don't know what it is, yet this is part of the curriculum for our classes and for particularly for our majors in political science is to understand these historical events and these items that created the foundation of the United States and of our governing documents. And once they get into understanding not only Three-Fifths Compromise, not only understanding the Electoral College, then to take it a few steps beyond to understand the implications of the Three-Fifths Compromise, understanding the implications of the Electoral College on present day. And it is fascinating that in some of their lifetimes, they get to see twice how the popular vote and the Electoral College vote don't match, and how that has an impact on who becomes president of the United States. So it's an interesting conversation and an interesting lesson in civic engagement and education.
Harry, I want to come back in a moment and hear about the role your students will play in the project. But Harry, I think at this point, it would be useful if you would describe sort of the formula that you've created with the Media Policy Center, where this isn't, your grandmother's documentary on PBS, right? This is more than a television program. This is an entire package that has designs way beyond people just seeing a piece of filmmaking.
What we created with Dale, my partner Dale Bella, and I created with the Media Policy Center was to create a media model where the PBS special broadcast is really the rock in the water. And the ripple effects are a companion book, and Ted Widmer is kind enough to be the editor and to write part of that book and to engage a board of advisors. Each will be offered a chance to write a chapter in the book, to create curriculum for K through 12, to create teach-ins at universities, so that to take what we consider capital, intellectual capital, and reformat it to create a comprehensive media package will leverage media in ways that really isn't done when you just do a program and it's after 2 showings, it's gone.
Yeah, Ted, one thing I've learned working at the Wilson Center with our history and public policy program, something that of course someone like you knows intimately, is that history isn't as static as it's presented to us in our younger years, and it's constantly evolving. Talk to us about what you hope to contribute with this book to the historic record.
Well, just to help the American public understand that things can be changed, that we have inherited certain practices that don't always work very well. They might be actively unfair, or they might just be clunky and not work, and that we have the right and the obligation to go back in and try to make things better. And it begins with a deep understanding of what actually happened in the summer of 1787 and why there were these competing pressures and why we failed to build a really solid democracy based on one person, one vote at the very beginning.
What would expand on that, please, if you would? What were the key elements of the negotiations that led to this failure?
Well, there are all kinds of compromises that needed to happen to get these 13 states to sign up for the Constitution. It took a while. The state I'm in, Rhode Island, didn't even approve until 1790. So, it really was, there were a lot of competing pressures and anxieties. Small states were worried that big states would have too much influence. Everybody was worried that a strong president might disrupt a system that was supposed to emanate out of the people. But the tension that they didn't talk about so much at the time, but which we know about, was between northern and southern states and their different labor practices. And the South derived a huge amount of its wealth from its slave population. But as they were negotiating, they were trying to also get political strength. And the tragedy was they inflated their popular count while making it absolutely impossible for the very people they were counting at the 3/5 rate to have any political voice of any kind. So they increased the political representation of slave owners while making it impossible for slaves to ever have a voice in the system.
Tammy, talk to us about your students' involvement. That's one of the interesting aspects of this larger package that Harry and the Media Policy Center are planning.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So our students will be able to service two functions. One is on the production team to help with, all that comes with producing this project. We will also have students, particularly those from the political science space, to help with research and development of some of the content and questions and the probing parts for us to have an engaging project and program that not only tells what 3/5 compromise is, not only to tell what the Electoral College is, also to move into the space of the impact and consequences of these elements on current day democracy, as well as, what can we do as a call to action to move forward so that we can move through a space, so we can move again to Ted's point of one person, one vote.
About that call to action, Harry was generous enough to share with me before we did this interview the presentation that you've all prepared to put in front of funders or supporters or potential board members. And it's quite ambitious, as I teased at the top of the program. Again, this isn't just about making a film and walking away. You're really talking about creating a movement to strengthen American democracy. So I want to get all of your thoughts on that. How ambitious are you letting yourself think about this? How grand a vision are you bringing to the table?
Well, if I could be so bold as to say with the same ambition as the framers of the Constitution was. So why not be as bold to say, let us have more than 65% of the electorate to participate in the general presidential election. Let us have more than just above 60 in some instances of voters participating on for state and local elections. Let us be so bold and ambitious to say that while we have laxed in our civic education in our school system, K through 12, let us fill that space that is missing in that formal arena, and let's step in and to be our brothers and sisters keepers and to spread our knowledge about civics, the education, the engagement, so that we can move toward that more perfect union.
Tammy, I asked for bold and you delivered bold. You did not shy away from the challenge. Ted, that's a tough act to follow. Give us your thoughts.
It is, but I'm so happy to be a part of this team with Tammy, and for a lot of reasons. She's going to bring some very motivated young people into the team also, in her students. And we want them, their energy and passion, and they too are feeling like the system is not really working for them for a lot of reasons. But also, we just saw in Tammy's state of Georgia what sustained attention to rules and technicalities and overturning technicalities that were designed to keep people from getting to the polls, what a huge national impact it can have. And so in the Senate elections, January 2021, we saw two people elected who might not have been elected only a couple years ago. And that turned the majority of the US Senate around and really is making a very big difference in our whole country, just because Georgia got its act together.
So,
John,
yeah, Harry, go ahead, please.
We're a different country than we were in 1787, 1789. We were primarily white landowners that was running the show, white male landowners. We're such a different demography right now. Our demographics are so different than, why can't we change and reform based on these changes? The intent was to as much as possible, bring young people into the production process, the promoting, the outreach, and people of color. And I am honored to be involved with Clark Atlanta University and Tammy. And the more I work with her, the more I see enormous potential. Why not other HBCUs? Why not other coalitions of universities to really spread the word out that it's really a time for the country to look in the mirror and say, let's change, let's reform, let's move forward, let's be a true democracy. It could be very exciting.
Well, around that, is it useful for us to continue to talk about a true democracy when technically that's not what we are? In other words, one thing I worry about is, are we setting young people up for disappointment?
Well, I think passing the baton to the next generation and asking them, they would say, thank you, you've had your moment in the sun. The other really strong fear I have personally is I don't want this country to be ruled permanently by a minority. And that's what's happening right now. Tammy made reference to that. Majority rules with respect to the minority. And that's what I grew up believing in. And I don't want to see that go away.
That's I guess what I was getting at is that, we learn that we live in the world's greatest democracy, often with lack of humility, we've called ourselves that. And yet, you just look at the Senate and what that says about representation. When you look at it state by state, I live in Fairfax County, Virginia, which has a population greater than many states that have 2 senators. We share ours with the rest of the state. So I would love to hear what the historians think about this. Have we misrepresented how America works in this regard?
Well, I don't know if we've misrepresented or we haven't really painted the full picture. Mm-hmm. So it's almost as if, we have this grand canvas of a picture and we've only shown a corner of it. We really don't put a lot of emphasis on the criticalness of state and local politics, which governs the vast majority of how, we are able to live on a day-to-day basis. And then how voting and participating on the state and local level has that impact on the federal level. And to understand that, states are the democracy, the laboratories of democracy. What happens on the state level then will spill over to the federal level. So we tend to do a top-down approach to political activity rather than a bottom-up. And if we understood that bottom-up approach and had an emphasis on the bottom-up approach, then we could have a more inclusive governing system. We could move toward a full democracy where there is this, the citizens are able to move together to govern. We don't do that though. And that's where that disconnect comes in, is that most of us have an understanding that the federal government fixes everything, that we have to run to the federal government in order to have policies that have equity to it. When, on a day-to-day basis, those policies start locally. And if we could understand that, then we can move and progress to the federal system. And yes, to a more inclusive democracy.
Ted, your thoughts?
Well, you make a great point, John, that democracy, it's a word we like today. It wasn't a word they always liked in 1787. They thought they were building a republic, not a democracy. And a democracy suggested a bit of chaos. If you let the people just run everything, nothing will get done, or the wrong people will be elected. So they did want safeguards then, and I don't think it would be accurate to say that they were trying for a pure democracy. But they did make big mistakes inside the Constitutional Convention. They did some great things too, but they made mistakes, and the Three-Fifths Compromise was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, and it really violated the spirit of the Declaration of Independence, which was only 11 years earlier, and is the founding document of the country and promises human rights to all people, not only here, but around the world. And if you're conspicuously denying rights to a huge part of your population, you are somehow undermining democracy with both a uppercase D and a lowercase d, and the spirit of Republican self-government. No African-American enslaved person could pursue life, liberty, or happiness. And so there was something really tragically wrong about the Three-Fifths Compromise at the beginning, and we're just trying to get to the bottom of long-term injustices that were perpetuated, so that the extra political power the South always had made it very hard to modify slavery in any way until the Civil War, of course, did. And then Jim Crow just sort of repeated a lot of the same injustices, and we're still working out a lot of those things. We have a lot to answer for, especially to our young people. So we're very eager to explain our history to the young people and see if they can take on some of these challenges.
And if I could,
sure, Tammy, go ahead, please.
That control from the pre-Civil War and even post-Reconstruction is still today. Because when you look at, those people inside, particularly the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives, the strong hold on a lot of the policies that lack progression come from the same 11 former Confederate states. So it's not just a history, as you said, John, it is moving forward to today that, we are continuing on that same trend.
Harry, we talked earlier, both Tammy and Ted had things to say about the election in Georgia, which saw, with increased voter turnout, 2 Democrats elected to the U.S. Senate, a cause for celebration for people who like turnout and Democrats, but Republicans saw this as a disaster, right? So how will you address in this project the built-in partisan angle where everyone theoretically is for democracy and for democratic values and for voting, but the reality is in any given race, that is an advantage or a disadvantage for a particular candidate. So how are you going to address that?
Well, I think the word transparency comes into play. Whatever we do has to work for both sides. We should be looking at ideas, not necessarily having politicians choose their electorate, but having the electorate choose their representatives. I think this is a rare time in our country's history. It's a great opportunity to rethink what can make the country a better place to be for all of our citizens. So I think transparency, rule of law, all the things we have become just words can have greater meaning going forward.
Ted and Tammy, I wonder, when you look at the history of the nation, this is not a new problem, right? You're going to have moments in history where there can be broader agreement on bigger goals when they are sort of described in a generic manner. But when you get down to particular races, you're often asking one party or one politician to sacrifice his or her ambitions for the greater good. Where does that kind of leadership come from? How do we get to a point where we think about something that's good for the nation for the next 50 or 100 years versus what's good for a particular candidate in the next 6 months?
Great question, John. I mean, we've done that over and over again. We've fought 2 world wars. The country was largely united behind, and both parties were behind. We did very generous things like the Marshall Plan to foreign countries that both parties were behind. And the New Deal came from a Democratic president, but it represented a mostly bipartisan consensus. And Dwight D. Eisenhower continued a lot of the New Deal policies. So we're at our best when both parties are working toward those big goals. But it hasn't been like that for some time. I mean, really since the 90s, I would say, and maybe some might say the 80s, we've had bitter partisan discord and deadlock in all kinds of ways. And what we're seeing now is something worse than partisan tension. We're seeing one party more than the other erode our democratic norms. And as Tammy was just saying, a lot of it is concentrated in the former Confederate states where slave owning was concentrated. And we can always have partisan differences over money or certain forms of policy. But when you start denying a lot of people to vote, that's not a democracy anymore. And so this is an existential threat to the United States of America. And we need to get through this. But then, yeah, I really hope we have two strong parties. I want to support what Harry said. We're not, I'm a Democrat, but we want to come out of this with two strong parties who both play by the rules.
Tammy, are your students hopeful or cynical in this regard?
As young people, they're cynical, yet extremely idealistic. I tell them quite often at the beginning of the semesters and even at the end that I admire their positive and bright outlook on our country. I really do. What is troubling, though, is their ability to move forward and to understand the work that it takes in order to get to that space. Because, currently in the age of instantaneous, results in some aspects, to understand that governing is a process. It may not move as quickly, right? This grand ship can't just move as quickly as a speedboat. And to have that patience in understanding of processes, and to understand that we need to look at the impact to different groups of peoples, not just the people that you know intimately, and to have those compromises, right? To understand one side is not going to get everything. Having a strong two-party system allows for there to be some give and take to where the masses are served by this. And if we can get the masses served, then we can get as much as we can to have a functioning, healthy governing system, economy, educated electorate, to where we can make decisions that are helpful to the most. I also want to note, and I completely agree with Ted, and to your question about what it takes to get more people to do what is right by policy rather than by the partisanship. I reflect back on former President Obama's speech when he received the Kennedy Profiled in Courage. And what he said was that there were several people who voted for the Affordable Care Act when it was a tough vote in their particular district, particularly the House of Representatives. And some of those folks lost their job, right? They were no longer a representative after that vote. Yet and still they did, because it was the right thing to do for the majority of the people in this country. It served the citizens of this country. If we can have more profiles in courage and celebrate those profiles in courage, then we can move to those spaces where we can have people, our elected officials who are there to serve the people, to spend more time looking at policy rather than the partisanship that really actually hurts their own constituency. Yet their partisanship overrides that understanding.
Harry, you're beginning the project with the Three-Fifths Compromise and all three of you explained eloquently why that's the case. But give us a preview of what you have planned as you look down the road to future episodes.
Okay. We want to explore democracy and the media. Certainly what's been going on in the past few years with fake news is very dangerous. To understand true representation in democracy, we want to look at voting, what has to be reformed in voting, One of the things, if I can go back a little, is
Sure.
we want to do a lot of grassroots filming. We want to go into communities. We want to ask people. We want to create a core of really junior journalists to go out and talk and maybe take their iPhones and do short films that would be included in Imagine Democracy. Imagine Democracy is really meant to be an invitation to get involved, to get empowered. Uh, I don't have the list in front of me. I should have, of the other episodes, but I think you have it, or Tammy and Ted can add to what we were talking about. But the first Threefifths is meant to put everything into context. And as Ted and Tammy said, the birth of this country was not perfect. And we're still suffering from these original sins. And why not try to make it better, you know? And young people have energy and creativity. And the more we engage young people, I think the better chance we have for positive reform.
Well, Ted and Tammy, Harry has sort of teed it up for you for final thoughts in that you are the board of advisors, or at least two members of the board of advisors. You know, we talked about, again, why it's important to talk about the Three-Fifths Compromise, not only has an historical moment, but also its legacy and its lasting legacy. But what are some of the other things that you hope the project will be looking at as it moves forward?
Well, there are a lot of ways in which the system has broken down over the last 20, 30 years. We saw a lot of manipulation of the media. I think both sides would probably claim that. We've seen terribly dark influence of money in politics, again, on both sides, sometimes secret money, but even when it's acknowledged, it's, you know, it can feel like if you're an ordinary person, you just have no vote. And that's not the same thing as voting right. It's just even casting your vote, you don't have enough power because you're not putting money into the system. So that's a problem. And we've seen a party that represents an increasingly small percentage of the voting public hold on, often through pretty ugly ways, into power, with lots of personal attacks against the other side and strange conspiracy theories that are not very good for democracy. So we just want to get back. We actually want to embrace the rules. We acknowledge these problems at the beginning, but we still think the system was working at its best, and we want to keep the rules from being corrupted. I feel like there has been some corruption over just the last 20 years. So we're trying to use people power and the power of young people to say, we are interested, we want to know our history, we want to do better, and we want to have a good future for ourselves. Thanks.
Tammy, you get the final word.
So as I like to tell my students, democracy is a muscle. If we don't use it, then it will, you know, do what muscles do, and they can fail. And, you know, to sum it up, you know, to Ted's points and to Harry's points, the small majority, a very minority group of individuals in the country really has done a fantastic job of manipulating the masses. So much so that, you know, conspiracy theory becomes real. People are under the assumption that the more money you have, the more the government works for you, which is should not be the way that a democratic system works. That the people really have power, and if we can empower the people to understand that people vote, not money, and you have a lot of the control. As a collective, if we can push people to use their power in citizenship, then we are able to move again to that space of equity and of a more perfect union. So let's use our muscles to strengthen this democracy.
Thank you very much. Good place to end. The project is Imagine Democracy, and the leadership team, you're seeing a big chunk of it today: Harry Wiland, Ted Widmer, and you just heard from Tammy Greer. Thank you, all of you, for joining us today, and wish you much success with the project. We look forward to hearing about it as it progresses.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
John.
We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.